Did you know that Saint Joseph is the patron saint of real estate? And according to tradition, if you want to sell your home, what you need to do is get yourself a Saint Joseph statue and bury it in your yard. But according to one website, you need to do it a little bit more than just bury it in your yard. You need to take your Saint Joseph statue and wrap it up in a cloth and bury it upside down in your yard, at least 12 inches deep, close to the for sale sign, which should be close to the street. Or if you own a condo, you can bury St. Joseph in a flower pot that's set in front of your door. Now, all of this may sound like a lot of superstition to you, but I can assure you, if you've been in a position where you needed to sell a house and couldn't seem to get the market to move, couldn't get that house off your shoulders, well, even the most scientific and rational and logical person will be tempted to lean on the saints. Sometimes we just want to close the deal. Sometimes we simply want a weight lifted off our shoulders. Sometimes we simply want an obstacle removed from our path. And we're willing to move beyond reason in our efforts to do so. Now, the St. Joseph tradition comes from the West. In the East, in India, among the Hindu tradition, there is the god Ganesha, the elephant god, who is known as the remover of obstacles. And the image that I get often is, it's like each one of us is a rider on the back of Ganesha, who is removing obstacles from our path with a trunk, sweeping up boulders and sweeping up fallen trees or debris that is blocking our way and helping us to move forward. So if you have an obstacle in your path in India, then you might turn to Ganesha. Or if you have a house you can't sell, then you might be tempted to turn to St. Joseph in the West. Now, all of this may sound like superstition, but I can assure you, if you've ever been in a position where you felt completely powerless, then you know that this is also a very human thing to do. Now, the idea that God might look like an elephant is very foreign to the Western mind. However, in the East, in India, there's a lot of emphasis on what theologians would call developing a non-anthropomorphic theology. In other words, there's a lot of emphasis on the realization that divinity does not look like us. Divinity takes many shapes and forms and can be seen in all of creation. Therefore, divinity might take the form of a man or a woman or a being that transcends gender, or might take the form of a swan or a buffalo or an eagle or a lion or a tigress or an elephant. However, if the idea of believing in a God that looks like an elephant is too big an obstacle for you, let's remove that obstacle. In fact, if the idea of believing in God at all is an obstacle, let's remove that obstacle this morning. And let's talk about the power to overcome. The power to overcome obstacles, to overcome opposition, to overcome barriers, to overcome challenges. Because that's something we all face, regardless of our beliefs. Now, sometimes the obstacles of life are outward. They're outside of ourselves. They are things like traffic and detours and bad weather or a pandemic or a closed business, an economic downturn, a lost job, a rejection letter, a breakup, a lack of resources. There are many different obstacles that can confront us that are outward. But there are also inner obstacles. Inner obstacles like self-doubt, fear, that inner critical nagging voice, the inner obstacle of burnout, despair, hopelessness, apathy. So whatever our beliefs, whatever we think with our heads, it's important for us to know that spirituality at its deepest level is about our ability to align with the power that removes obstacles, busts through barriers, overcomes opposition. Spirituality is found when we rally for a good cause and we are able to sing together that we are not afraid and we shall overcome someday. There's a Buddhist story that is told about a king who was worried his people were getting very lazy, so he decided to create a challenge for them. And he got his men to roll this giant boulder in the middle of the main road that went through the city that was the capital of his kingdom. And he sort of sat aside and sort of went into the shadows to see how people would handle this challenge. Well, the first person to walk up to the boulder just started cursing it, just was angry at the boulder, but didn't make any effort to move it, just walked off. The next person come along got really furious, lost their temper, and kicked the boulder, but then they stubbed their toe and they limped off, and they didn't try to move it either. After a while, a few people came, and they would push for a while, but they'd give up, and it was pretty much a half-hearted effort. Finally, a person came along who was really pushing very hard, seemed to be giving all their strength to moving the boulder, but it didn't seem to be making any difference. But then that person got an idea, went off, and got this big old log, which they used as a lever, and they used the lever to dislodge the boulder so that it rolled down the street and out of the way, and the traffic was able to flow again. And underneath the boulder, the person discovered there was a purse of gold coins that were created as a reward from the king. And it also had a written message, and the message said, "The obstacle is the way. The obstacle in the path becomes the path. Every obstacle is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to change, and improve." Now that's the story. But it kind of reminds me of something I learned from the 20th century Unitarian theologian Henry Nelson Wyman. Here's a book about him that was written by Bruce Southworth, who grew up in our church and went to our Sunday school. And he wrote this book, and he decided to give it the name At Home in Creativity. And the reason he chose that title is because for Henry Nelson Wyman, creativity and divinity were synonymous. And if you think about it, every obstacle in our path is an opportunity for creativity. Therefore, every obstacle in our path has the potential to become an encounter with divinity. The Stoic philosophers often said the obstacle is the way. And one of the reasons they felt this way is because they felt that human beings weren't made to sort of be adapted to the status quo or a static reality, that we were made to change, that we were made to be creative, that we were made to blaze new trails and forge new paths. And here's the thing, the newer the path, the more obstacles are in it. And the more we forge our own path, the more likely we are to encounter obstacles. So those of us who are wanting to live creative lives, we are constantly given an opportunity to turn an obstacle into the way. Behind me is the church banner that was designed with the colors from the women's suffrage movement. And this week marks 100 years since women gained the right to vote. So that seems like a very special occasion to celebrate, a very patriotic moment in the life of our country. And one of the things that made the suffragist activists so powerful is they knew how to turn an obstacle into the way. Many of them were arrested and taken to jail and given expensive fines. And many of the ones in the streets were verbally or physically assaulted. Many were handcuffed. And some were forced on to eat food when they were on hunger strike. But one of the things they learned was the more they were mistreated, the more publicity they got for the cause. So much so that when Lucy Burns was handcuffed to her bars in her cell by a police officer, she later turned to a friend and said, "Splendid. It gets worse and worse." She knew the worse it got, the more publicity she would get for her cause, and the more the cause would advance. Now, that's not easy to do, but it is a remarkable thing that activists can do. But the philosophers, the ancient philosophers, the Stoic philosophers, they remind us we can do this in our everyday lives. We can turn our everyday obstacles into the way. We can use them to advance our cause, advance our direction. Many times when we see an obstacle, we get angry. But it's not the obstacle itself that makes us angry. It's our emotional reaction to the obstacle. It's the way our emotions color how we see the obstacle. And if we can back off and become a little bit more detached, we might see it as an opportunity to be creative and to think new thoughts and to do things in a different way. Now, I realize that this is easier said than done. And I'm also very much aware that I'm prescribing medicine that I don't always want to take myself. Many years ago, I was watching an episode of The West Wing, and I love that show. I think it's a wonderful show. But at some point, I realized that this show, the things that happen in the show, are what I hate about life. Because so often, nothing goes according to plan. Big mistakes are made that foul everything up. Somebody sabotages somebody else's project. It's all about disruption. It's all about things that don't go the way you'd hope they go. And that's what drives me nuts about life. And yet, somehow, it makes for a very good television. So I know that I'm prescribing medicine that's not easy for me to take myself. But even so, I'm mindful of a conversation I had with the Reverend Lynn Strauss when she was minister of this church and I was religious education director. We were driving up to the Mountain Retreat Center, and we were, which is in Highlands, North Carolina, and we were driving through those beautiful, gorgeous Smoky Mountains. Now, Lynn is from Illinois, where it's very flat, and at some point she turned to me, and I'm pretty sure she was joking. She said, "You know, just think how much faster we could get there if it weren't for all these mountains." And it made me realize that if you're a flatlander, you might look at the mountains that are all around us and see them as obstacles that prevent you from getting someplace quickly. But these mountains that surround the Tennessee Valley fill me with breathless awe and wonder, and they are an important part of why I love living in East Tennessee. It's just they aren't an obstacle to the way. The mountains are the way for me. So here is my hope for you as you move forward. I don't know what your obstacle is in your personal life, but it is my hope that in some way you will find a way forward that lets you make the obstacle into a way. And if that doesn't work, you can always buy a St. Joseph statue.